This is very exciting. Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. A couple of quick notes before I get to my interview this week. I want to remind you that the S424 call for presentations, we're in the final month. It closes on August 30th. So if you want to submit something, you go to s4xevents.com/CFP. It's really simple. I've put out some notes on there as to what will increase your chances of getting in. But probably the biggest thing I tell you is do not wait till August 30th to submit, because we'll have accepted most of the sessions. You'll be one of 100 that come in at the last minute. So if you really want to get on that S4 stage, you should submit something, I would say in the next week or two, definitely before August 15th. That gives us some time to go back and forth and maybe pull out a kernel that might be an S4 session out of what you originally submitted. And with that, Liz, let's bring on our guest. Keep the intro short this time. Our guest this week is Gus Serino. He is, I guess, varied career. You started as a mechanical engineer. You got your degree in college as a mechanical engineer. You worked for a couple of companies, but you spent most of your time, 15 years from 2004 to 2019. Gus was at the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, MWRA, which, for those of you not familiar with the Boston region, they provide most of the water and wastewater for the greater Boston region and some of the other cities in Massachusetts. They have, I had a number here, but they provide it to millions of people. So it's a very large water utility. We're going to talk about water in this episode. In 2019, Gus moved to Dragos, where he was there for 4 years, and he started his own company in 2022 and is now a small business owner. So we might talk a little bit about that. Well, Gus, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dale. Appreciate you having me.
If we're going to talk about water, we got to start with the big thing. We got to start with Oldsmar. Absolutely. And I've really wanted to get someone who understood how water systems work on the show. I've had a number of private conversations with water experts, JB and some others that people might know. But there was a quote in Wired that I think highlighted what happened best. So Wired said, within seconds, the intruder was attempting to change the water supply's levels of sodium hydroxide, also known as lye or caustic soda, moving the setting from 100 parts per million to 11,100 parts per million. In low concentrations, the corrosive chemical regulates the pH level of potable water. At high levels, it severely damages any human tissues it touches. And that is, I'm sure, all correct. I don't have a problem with that. That this was the command that was set. Now, since that time, there's been people with Oldsmar Water that said, no, it wasn't a hack. There was someone who made an error. But let's assume for this conversation that everything in that paragraph was correct.
Yep.
Someone got in, they got to an HMI, they increased the level from 100 parts per million to 11,100 parts per million. What I'd like to run through with you, Gus, is the actual physical part of the water system.
Yep.
And how this would work. And I guess where I'd start is, would a water system ever want the capability of delivering 11,100 parts per million of sodium hydroxide?
No, of course not. Definitely.
Well, no, I didn't know. Like, I thought, I'm not a water person, so perhaps they could say, look, when we're just starting out with a new batch, we dump a lot in quickly to deal with it. But you're saying that doesn't happen.
No, generally no. pH correction is used mostly for corrosion control. It's sort of at the end of the process. It's just to keep the pipes from corroding, and they raise the pH. Oftentimes they bring it back down, try to keep the alkalinity high, and it's really about corrosion control. And so, yeah, you'd never want to dose that much chemical. Certainly, I mean, it's not even possible, I think, in Oldsmar. I don't want to jump ahead of your question, but the point, they would never get to that dose. The point, though, would be that it could get to 100% on the controller output and put out the max amount of output. And without going.
Let's jump into that. So then this is, we get to the part that I know, and we quickly get to the part that I have no idea. So certainly if I am programming my PLC, I am not going to accept a command in my PLC if I'm writing my logic correctly. I'm not going to accept the command to dump 11,100 parts per million, right? I'm going to have some boundary checking in my code. That's possible, but an attacker, in theory, if they were in the system, could reprogram the logic.
Absolutely.
So they could. So let's assume they reprogram the logic, and the PLC, in fact, wants to execute a command to dump 11,100 parts per million of lie into the system. I would think the next thing would be, is the system capable of supplying that much?
Right.
Like, have you physically set it up so it could supply that much? So would you ever set up a system that had that possibility?
No. I don't know what that's like a ridiculously high amount. That's like off the charts high. That's somebody who did input validation in, which is normal. Actually, what you said there about, programming your PLC to only take the proper inputs, that's rare, honestly, especially in water where it's low bid. The systems integrators and the plans and specs that get written they don't have a lot of checks on, are you limiting your input and limiting your bounds, and so that's not in there. The 20 PLC controls that Sarah and many others are doing are talking about that, but that's not very common. You don't find that. What would limit it is simply the output of the pump, and that could be dangerous, right? So one thing you touched on is the PLC. And typically, even with something like this, you won't find any hardwired physical interlock that's going to stop that metering pump. What's going to stop the metering pump from running on high pH, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, is in that PLC. The high alarm to say shut down is usually, that logic is in the same PLC that's running the process, which is a weakness and a problem in a lot of water systems.
Okay, so you've got a tank of this chemical and a pump, is what I'm hearing. And so let's say you sent the command. Let's say you've completely owned that PLC, so it's not going to alarm. It's not going to do anything. You can actually send the command to that pump to run at its maximum level and not turn off. How big are these chemical bins?
So that's the thing. It varies widely from water system to water system. I've been in a lot of water utilities, and they are not the same ever. They really vary significantly according to the source water that they're treating. Even the regulations are you won't find any sort of EPA, you shall do this to check your water parameters, because in the permit for each water system are the parameters that they need to monitor for, and the frequency and the chemical treatment, because it varies so much. And so I could not tell you how big the tanks are at Oldsmar or anywhere without going there, because they really do vary from site to site to site. They may they may have.
And at what point, where is this water? Where would this chemical be going into? Would it be going in at a last moment before the water goes into the distribution system, or would it be going in the reservoir?
No, it wouldn't be going in the reservoir. Sometimes pH correction can happen early in a process to like control a treatment. And then that corrosion control part that I mentioned, that usually happens towards the end of the treatment process, like on the way out of the plant. Or oftentimes, like, some water utilities may have to do, they may have groundwater, so they don't need to do a lot of treatment, and they may just have corrosion control facilities right after the wells. And so it might be, a well building that's pumping into the distribution system. It goes to a corrosion control facility, like a small building that pumps hydroxide in, and then it goes out right into the distribution system with nothing. You'll see that depending on the source water. So it does vary, really does. And I don't know Oldsmar's process. So
okay, well let's stay with kind of the worst case.
Yeah.
So hacker got in to the HMI, sends the command, has modified the PLC so it will actually send that command to the pump to put out as much as the pump can put out, and turned off any alarming in that same PLC. And let's say it's a big vat of chemical, so there's plenty of sodium hydroxide, and it's going in close to where the distribution system, kind of in the worst spot, What what would happen next? Would there be any sort of post that point water quality check? Are there filters that would break down? Any alarms that would go off? What would happen next?
Nope, you get it. So there's precedence for this in Spencer, Mass. In 2007, an operator was doing some sort of calibration. I think they left a metering pump in running in manual and overnight, and it built up a huge slug of sodium hydroxide at a low demand period in the morning. The people of Spencer, Mass. started taking showers, and 100 people went to the hospital with chemical burns. Luckily, there was no serious injuries beyond that, but absolutely, that you'll get a concentrated slug of chemical that is sitting in that distribution, whether it's in a storage tank or, if it's a large enough distribution, you might be lucky and get some good dilution, but you could absolutely cause health and safety impacts by doing that.
And what was that place in Massachusetts that you said?
Spencer, Massachusetts.
Spencer, Mass. And about how long ago was that? Do you know?
2007.
2007. Burned in your memory.
Yeah.
Poor choice of words on my point. Etched in your memory. Okay, well that's very good. So in theory, if everything lined up, if the attacker went through all these sorts of things, there is a possibility that people could have been harmed.
No doubt.
And what if you would have drank such water? I mean, you talk about showers, but what if you would have drank water like that?
Yeah. Good. I mean, it could be. It's dependent on the concentration. It's the most corrosive chemical that used in water treatment and that I've seen. It could be death. It could be certainly sickness, death. That stuff just burns through flesh. Like when you're handling sodium hydroxide, the PPE that's required is like very high and is a real hazard handling that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Worse than acid by a lot.
Well, and and there's of course the physical protection of that as well, right? Of that chemical.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen some of these municipal water treatment plants right by schools and other things that are a little bit scary from the physical side. But I think people are a little more aware of that than they are on the cyber side, I'm guessing.
Yeah, for sure. And to your point, like, them just changing that set point, fine. There's so many things that are going to stop that bad thing from happening. But as you had pointed out, the level of access they had to get to that HMI, there was so many things that could have happened that would bypass all those protections. And that's why when this happened, Oldsmar happened, I was at Dragos and I wrote a blog on it and I put out a little sketch. Like, I feel like this is where we need to be, is where you have those legitimate health and safety impacts. That's where we need, it's not a very scalable solution across the whole industry, but like you can take a hardwired contact from the pH transmitter that's measuring the pH and wire it through a relay directly to the metering pump and just shut it down. And who cares what the PLC is telling it to do? And in those cases, our design engineers need to think about that and build that in. There's not a lot of those cases, but that's certainly one of them.
That's a great example. You actually took my next question, because especially for a small utility, assuming they're going to do cybersecurity at such a high level that they're going to be able to reduce the likelihood to almost nothing of being hacked, it seems like our best use of resources is to do something like that, to put something in the physical process, or even step back from potential automation in these small utilities. Like they can automate a lot more, so you need fewer people, but maybe they need some either hardwired safety system that can't be hacked, or some sort of person out there that is doing manual checks every 12 hours or something like that, on top of whatever they can manage to do in cybersecurity. To me, for the small and medium water, which represents 100,000 water utilities right now, that seems to be the answer to me, rather than saying, hey, we're gonna get you to be experts in OT cybersecurity in the next 3 years.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. You can't do it everywhere. It's too expensive and too complicated, but certainly in those really bad possible scenarios, I think it needs to be part of it for sure. you just mentioned something that I wanted to touch on, but oh yeah, the automation that's just not going anywhere. There's like a shortage of operators out there. People don't want to take those jobs anymore, and so the automation isn't going anywhere. So we need to think about taking the highest risk things just off the table with cyber physical safety systems, essentially.
Well, and it's funny, we're going to talk about the EPA in a little bit here and regulation, but I wrote an article, I think it was October 2022, what I would do if I was king. If I could put in any regulation I wanted. And I think I would regulate these water utilities that said they have to have the capability of delivering drinkable water within a certain amount of time period of an outage. I wouldn't be trying to say you need this and this and this control, but these small utilities, they can do automation, but they have to be able to deal with these potentially bad events that could hurt people and also be able to recover and run things manually for some period of time if their automation fails, because they just are not going to have the resources to have the high degree of availability that you might have had at your old employer.
100%.
Opinion.
And honestly, Dale, a lot of them have that, right? So I can't speak a lot for, Western water utilities, but in the East here, even though they're independent utilities, there's usually at least one or two interconnections, emergency interconnections to an adjacent water system. So if your plant's down for some reason, you can turn on that interconnection and get water while you recover. And so that is already there. They already know how to do that from just like other issues not related to cyber. And so that little process or procedure needs to make it into their cyber incident response plan. It's not always the first step, but it's in there. And usually that's a possibility.
Well, and we have to be careful because the values of automation are huge. And we've seen this in other sectors where they've had capabilities to do things and they've eventually removed those because they didn't need them every day, but then they didn't have those in an emergency case. So I think especially in small and medium water, as they get more efficient and better, which they should, there should be some sort of gate. And this is where I think an EPA could really have an impact in saying, you must be able to do this sort of thing. And you must be able to prove that you can do it. Let's say if your system is completely hacked and unavailable, prove that you can do this, provide this critical service to your customer base if you've been hacked.
Absolutely. And I think that it's not a big jump for that, honestly. Water ISAC recently came out with a bunch of case studies, some physical and some cyber. And some of the cyber ones were ransomware related. And what I sort of expected is that they were able to run in manual and run in without the HMI while they were recovering, whether it was in, sort of a blind auto doing rounds or manual operation while they recovered. And it was fine because water systems are not super dynamic like a refinery or anything like that. And if you've just lost your HMI, but the system is still running on the PLC, those things are designed to start up and stop themselves without operator intervention. So if you are just making rounds looking for problems, you probably can get by while you recover from just a ransomware event. If it's something worse, like you're talking about, which are, low frequency, high impact ones, then you're talking about either boil water just so you can fight fires and, function in society, but maybe you can't drink the water, or do not drink order, or you're isolating a part of your system and using your emergency interconnect with an adjacent water system to run. But I think that a lot of that capability is already there. It's just water systems haven't talked about it in terms of cyber much.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, there's a few things that you point out there. One is I think we're there actually on a lot of the small and medium water where it's considered to be such a disaster. It might be, that's a strong word. It might be a disaster from a cybersecurity standpoint, but it's not a disaster from the mission metrics that a water utility would have delivering water. They can do that. So I think that's one thing. And we got to really make sure that we focus on that. So I'm actually more worried about large water utilities. We'll talk about them in a little bit than the small ones. I think the small ones just have to make sure they don't advance themselves out of the capability they currently have.
Couldn't agree more with that.
And then the second point is we also have to be realistic on recovery times and service level requirements. While everyone wants water all the time, you can live with a boil water notice. If you said the worst thing in the world is you're going to have a boil water notice for 1 day a year, that's not great. I'm sure the utility would not be happy with it, but you can do it. I've told the audience we had a major rainstorm here on Maui about a year and a half ago, and we had no drinkable water for 2 months. We had no water for 7 days and no drinkable water for 2 months. And it was not good, but no one died. It was inconvenient. You had to drive, 10, 15 miles to get water at the beginning. And then you had to drive maybe a half mile after that if you wanted to get drinkable water. So we shouldn't be saying, oh, if the utility can't provide drinkable water for a day, it's a tragedy. It's something that can never happen. What's more important, I think, is the example you gave. We don't want this sodium hydroxide burning or killing people. We don't want, let's say, no water available for many days and no drinkable water for months. Then you start to shut down a city or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, I mean, sort of the public reaction is one of the bigger risks there too. You get a boil water order for a day in a congested area, and people are fighting in the aisles for drinking water. I've seen it myself. It's kind of unfortunate. I think that's part of the thing that we need to think about leadership wise on, controlling that message, because I've seen it. We had a major pipe break a few years back on the MWA side, and there was a boil water order, and the public reaction was tough. I don't know.
Yeah. I know what you mean. And it's funny because when I lived in Miami or South Florida, there'd be a hurricane coming. You'd get days of notice that a hurricane was coming. So people could fill up jugs and bathtubs and whatever they wanted with drinkable water. And literally the hurricane goes by, the water system's down, and people are panicked because they have no water. So I think it is a little bit on our leadership to say you have to be somewhat self-sufficient in this world. And that's the message of these utilities have to be perfect, I think, is a little self-defeating. It's they're going to do better. They're going to meet this level of service most of the time. And then these things will take longer in events. And I guess we're used to thinking of weather as events, but cyber incidents, just like pandemics and other things, are things that can happen and you have to deal with. Let's shift now. So I think the small medium are actually a bright spot, somewhere where we can solve the problem pretty easily if we don't get distracted like we might be getting. The larger ones I worry more about, and I have a little bit of experience with a couple of large water systems that support city for water and wastewater. But in those cases, the automation was essential. If they lose the systems, they just can't send enough people out to keep things running or to restore things. What do you see as the answer for the large water systems?
I mean, so the answer, I don't know. I know that the risks are higher, sort of that likelihood, the bigger target, bigger profile, the likelihood in that risk equation is much higher. Mm-hmm. And the automation, you point out astutely, it's not going away. And it's critical in it, and they are oftentimes, like MWRA is the source of water for so many of the communities. 2.5 million people are fed off it. So I think it goes back to the engine. Starts with the design. The cyber informed engineering is such a great concept. It needs to come in there. The systems need to be built to be resilient to that. We need awareness in the ICS engineer space to understand the possible, right? So I always use this example of, in a lot of water and wastewater, suppose you need 3 pumps, so you put 5 in. So, one's down for service, one fails, you're good to go. But then you take all those VFDs and you stick them on the same network, and then in one thing, they're all bricked and you're toast. That's the piece that I think we're missing, is keeping those low-level, super important equipment distinct from maybe the edge of the control system network that touches enterprise or touches internet, so that you limit the damage, because we can't defend. You can't just be an impenetrable fortress, that's for sure. So it becomes down to understanding your response, going through tabletops and scenarios, understanding, taking this off the table and seeing what your response can be, what you can live without, being more efficient in your response. So if you lose a system or you lose a facility, how you can, reroute water to cover that section of the distribution, or what plant can you bring online to make up the loss from one plant being down, that kind of thing. We need to think through that from a cyber point of view. On one end, build our control system more resilient. Like you alluded to earlier, a lot of engineers are, for cost savings, are taking important equipment and sticking it on the network just because it's easier to get all that diagnostic information. You don't need to run wire and conduit for 4 to 20 milliamps and all the stuff like that, and take off the hand switches and the local displays, because you don't need it, right? You're going to trust the digital, and then all of a sudden you do need it. And I think that that's the mistake we're making, is we need to make sure we're maintaining that resilience in how the systems are built. We're understanding how we can respond when we're losing things from cyber related issues. And I think that, and worry less about trying to protect or build the fortress and protect anybody from getting in, because it's almost impossible, I think.
I want to take two different spins on what you just said. The one is on what you called cyber informed engineering. I think that's a worthy effort. And when I look at the program and DOE, which could be moved to EPA and anywhere else, it's a concept more than anything to do with electric specifically. But a lot of these systems are already in place. So I worry a little bit, because they're going to take 3 years to define cyber-informed engineering, and then if you do it, it's going to take 5. I've had this truth or consequences keynote where I'm telling people they should do exactly what you say, except they should just look at their system, assume the bad guy's in there already, and have someone, this is where cybersecurity can really help the engineers. Have someone come in there and say, by the way, what's really bad that could happen and what's stopping it? And they might say, oh, we have these soft interlocks, like this pH sensor or this pH alarm you said in the PLC. Well, the cybersecurity guy is going to be able to say, well, what if I reprogram that? They might think, oh, that's bulletproof, that'll stop anything. So you have those kind of discussions. What's the really bad thing that could happen? Could we do it cyber? What can you put in that would prevent it from happening at cyber? Or what could you do so you could recover in a time that's acceptable? Maybe not ideal, but acceptable to the organization. I think you can get some really quick wins in that. If you just pursue that. And I'm really hoping we see more of that. Are you seeing any appetite for that in the water sector?
I think unfortunately, it comes down to if an organization is lucky enough to have a champion who gets it and wants to work that side, because there's no discipline, right? No water utility that I'm aware of, it has like an OT cybersecurity person on a roll. Where I was, Andrew Hildick-Smith and I and a bunch of people in the SCADA group, we understood the problem and we worked on it. We were interested in it. Jake Brodsky, like lots of people in the water industry know it, but you're really relying on, are you fortunate enough to have a champion who gets the problem, who wants to work it? And then we always had to do battle with some folks who were like, what are you doing? This is not a problem we need to spend time and resources solving. Like there's this belief that it's like maybe not a real issue that we need to worry about. And that's like a real problem when you're trying to make some progress, because it costs money, costs effort, costs time to do all this.
Yeah, it's funny. I always have to be careful. I have such a distorted view of the market, in the sense that people who call me, people that come to S4, people when I do a little bit of consulting here and there, they're the leading edge. They're the pioneers and early adopters. You don't call someone like me if you're if you're a laggard or even in the majority. You're at the beginning. And so I've seen some large water utilities that have dedicated OT security teams and are well along their journey and have quite impressive programs, some of which would rival what you see in the electric sector, for example. So
Definitely.
they are out there, but I take your point that it's probably not universal. So we now have EPA stepping up and saying, we need to get involved in this. We need to set up some regulations. Maybe could you characterize what you see EPA doing? What are they doing? And what do you think the impact of what they're doing will be?
Yeah. So a lot of controversy on it, right? But I personally commend the EPA on what they did, right? So there's just like NERC CIP, there's a lot of people challenging their authority that they're using to do this, but I'm just glad they did it. For the longest time, our community has been saying we need to start getting a handle on this, and they stepped up. But they did it in the right way, in my opinion. They said, look, what we need is an assessment. Everybody has to go and do an assessment and submit those results of their cybersecurity assessment in their next sanitary survey. A sanitary survey is basically, somebody from the regulatory body comes and looks at their facility and makes sure they're doing things right with chemicals and physical security. Cyber was never a part of it. Now you have to do a cyber risk assessment and submit that as part of your sanitary survey. And to their credit, they made it pretty easy, in my opinion. They said you can do your own self-assessment, you can, like the CSET or something like that. You can have the sanitary surveyor come out and ask some predefined questions, which are directly mapped to the CISIS CPGs, which I think is a great document. And so it's, just answer these questions. Do you have an asset inventory? Do you do any monitoring? What's your remote access situation? And so you answer these questions, you submit that as part of your sanitary survey, or you can sign up for, they have a contractor, Horsley Witten, that does like a 90-minute phone call. I sat in on them. They're not super complicated. And you answer a bunch of questions. And even if you don't know, you say, I don't know. It goes in with your sanitary survey. And that's it. EPA just wants to gather the data. Then what they said is any remediation action is going to get pushed down to the local authorities, the states. And the states are going to think about that. My experience with EPA regulations is really around drinking water quality, like PFAS or if and what they do is they have, when they're coming out with a new regulation, they'll have a pretty long draft period where they're going to say, hey, water utilities, we're thinking about doing this. You need to have, for example, if you have surface water, like a reservoir, that's your source of water, you're going to need to have 2 different primary disinfection mechanisms. And you have to think about what those are going to be for your utility. And when we go to regulation, now there's going to be this period where you're going to have like years or whatever to put this in place. And so there's this draft period where they're sort of foreshadowing, and then there's this long runway to get the stuff in. That gives the utilities enough time to go to the engineers, the civil engineers who design the systems, and say, look, this is coming. Help me come up with a solution. That's the way I was assuming that this would roll out, which means that, the civil engineering companies and the systems integrators who are building the control systems can get educated and look at it as a business opportunity to figure out how to deliver this service. I'm not a big fan of regulations personally, but we need the regulations so that the utilities can go to town meeting or whatever it is and say, look, we have this regulation. In addition to covering PFAS, now we have to do cybersecurity. We need this funding. It lands in the plans and specs. When you build a control system, it needs to be secure. Here's how. The engineers write those specs. The systems integrators or specialty vendors come in. They build it secure out of the box. And we're all in a better state for it. Yes, it costs money, but we have to do it. That's what I thought the EPA was going. Unfortunately, it's held up in court right now. I think a few states challenged it based on the authority, the rule that they used to say they had the authority, and a judge basically put it on hold, which kind of bums me out personally. I know that a lot of people didn't like it, but I commended the EPA for what they did, and I think it was at least starting to move the ball forward. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. You called it at one point cybersecurity assessment, and then you called it a cyber risk assessment. So is it an evaluation of the controls, the security controls in place, or is it an evaluation of the risk of a cyber attack damaging the ability to provide the
My
service?
bad on that. No, it's the controls in place. It's looking at the CISA CPGs essentially, and seeing what are you doing? Do you have an asset inventory? Do you have monitoring? Do you have logging? That kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I have mixed feelings on that. On one hand, you could say, yes, they're bare minimums. They should be done. But on the other hand, you look at the water systems across the country. You have the extreme examples like Jackson, Mississippi, and that where they're just falling apart and they need to spend a lot of money building up the water infrastructure and creating a cyber asset inventory when it's not going to reduce risk in a municipal. I'm like, why am I diverting my attention and resources there? So I have mixed feelings. And then the other thing that I always worry about is these lists seem to get longer. And one of the real problems with NERC CIP was it did raise the floor, but at a pretty substantial cost. Not only cost in terms of resources, but cost in terms of diverted attention to things that might have actually moved the needle. So I agree with you to a sense, but I worry.
So, and I 100% hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree. What I was hoping, and I kind of have reason to believe that they would do it this way, just because, my experience with how things have gone, both with the CPGs and with, what they've rolled out so far, is they weren't going to come out with this, like the TSA pipeline one, where it's just like, here's this gigantic list of things you need to do. Like, here it is. Let's make sure you have an incident response plan that includes operations and your operational technology. Secure your remote access solution. There's two. Like, forget about asset inventory, because the truth of it is, Dale, we're not talking about a refinery. All these water utilities, 55,000 water utilities, most of them have 2 computers and like 10 PLCs. Like, they're tiny. They don't need the asset inventory. They need to secure their remote access, and they need to make sure that they have incident response plans that include how they're going to respond on the operational side. Come out, just baby step it. That's what I think they would do. I hope that they would do, because honestly, the Massachusetts DEP, and all the local authorities, they're like, look, we can't even deal with this. We're dealing with PFAS. We're dealing with all these other regulations. We're understaffed. Please don't give us cyber to deal with too. And so hopefully when those surveys go back and they see that all these deficiencies are there, then the local states are like, all right, what can we do? What's the biggest bang for our buck? Incident response planning and secure remote access, and start there. And that's not super hard, No,
and those would be the logical too. I think you might get a disagreement amongst a few people, but I think most would say those would be at least two of the top 5. They would be my top 2 as well.
Yeah.
And I guess recovery is part of your incident response plan.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. That the challenge with government is, and actually even with internal security, is you get in more trouble for leaving off a security control and getting compromised.
I know.
Than you do enlisting. The incentives are wrong, and somehow we'll have to see how that works out. Let's shift a little bit back to you.
Okay.
So I knew you when you were with MWRA, and then you moved to Dragos. And I was going to ask you if you had any dirt on Rob Lee, but I'll give you a break there and just say, very different environment.
Absolutely.
Hard charging, fast moving startup from 15 years in a water utility that's probably very conservative and set in its ways and such. What was one of your big learnings or surprises in that 4-year journey in Dragos?
So, it was, like you said, it was a completely different experience. I was surrounded by, honestly, some ridiculously talented people, and it was a really great culture. Everybody was willing to help. One of the most early on impactful things was, because I came from the water utility, that question of, are we fighting the boogeyman here? Is this a real thing? And then I'm working with, so they have a lot of ex-military, ex-NSA, and I'm working with people who otherwise are like, well, yeah, we were our APT, right? So it is real. even though you don't see it very often. So it's something we need to work on. So that would like sort of check that question off. Like, we're not fighting the boogeyman. This is something we need to focus on, even if most of the adversaries that we're tracking don't really have the ability to go to ICS kill chain stage 2, right? We still have to worry about it. So that was one thing that was really fun for me. Not only the culture, but, you know, validating that this is an important mission to be on. Another interesting one was seeing how hard it is to build technology, honestly. There's like seeing the pressure, the mission, everybody's like so passionate to go out there and do it. And so there's this pressure of like getting out there versus making the technology perfect and all the different use cases. Like on the OT Watch team, we needed the platform to do this and the customers needed the platform to do that. And, you know, chasing energy and all these different verticals. I mean, the engineering team had their work cut out for them. And it was interesting to see how hard it is to do that. So that was something interesting for me.
What about you were at MWRA for a long time. Was there anything that you said, oh, you mentioned that it's not the boogeyman, that the threat is real, but was there anything that you said, oh, I wish I knew this when I was back doing my old job?
Oh yeah. So I spent we like most utilities, like spent way too much effort locking things down to the nth degree and too much focus on protection, not enough on response and detection and resilient control systems. And so, you know, it's so hard to take a control system that's already running and harden it to the point where it's impenetrable. And that's what we were trying to do, because we didn't know what we were fighting and we didn't have any way to detect, right? So we were doing all these steps to secure the system. And the big question was, how do you know when you're attacked? And it was communications will be slow, application might crash. And we're like, that's a normal day working on a SCADA system, right? Comms are always going down. So like, once you start to see who are actually defending, what the TTPs are, and think about it more intelligently, you can be way more efficient in terms of the choices you make to protect and detect and respond. And it takes a little bit of the pressure off. We spent way too much effort on every little detail, which we didn't need to do.
That's really good point. And I don't think it means that protection isn't important. It's just finding out which ones are actually going to be worth the time and effort. And maybe when you work with Reed and some of the other offensive talent at a place like Dragos, you start to see, well, the idea that we're going to set up a perfect system that they're not going to be able to hack once they get inside is probably a fool's dream. And
absolutely.
So, and I think I'm hoping, I know a lot of money has been spent on detection. I think detection's harder to measure and justify, but response is the one that is just so clear that that's where money should be put. I think protection and detection, you kind of have to find that right range at a certain point. Like you said, with protection, trying to harden, a panel or something like that, or even doing more than just shutting off services on a PLC, but trying to do other things on a PLC, you're probably never going to protect that PLC.
That's right.
So, you're wasting your time. So it's the same thing with detection. No detection is a mistake. There is a line where you start to spend too much on it, and finding that level is really key. But incident response, to me, seems to be the one that is chronically underinvested in 2023.
Yep, I agree with response. I do also, I still feel pretty strongly that detection is a good way to go. And the reason is, if you come out with a technology that works, that you can passively look for incidents, you can't just do network, right? You have to have host base, and you don't have to go crazy, but you have to have some host base logging and some network detection. And the reason I like that is because the alternative, we're not talking about response, but talking about the protective side, is when you take a working system and you try to apply CIS benchmarks or other hardening standards, or first of all, you're going to break something that's already working. So it's a really inefficient process of going back and forth trying to figure out how to get it as hardened as you can and doesn't break it. And then, by the way, all those control systems are running on vulnerable services anyway, so you're not really you're just like reducing the attack surface, but there's always an attack surface. And so that's why I feel like it's a really lot of effort and really time consuming and not totally scalable to focus so much on protection. Whereas detection, if you get a platform that can go in and sit there and help you to identify in advance of needing response, I think that's a huge win. And I don't, it's expensive. And so trying to find a cost-effective one for under-resourced utilities and things is a challenge. But I think I don't want to leave it off the table. I think it's important. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, I wouldn't leave it off the table. I think where we're struggling is how to measure it. We just do a lot of hand waving and we do these metrics. You and I just did it, in the last 5 minutes talking about this. And where do you allocate funds and where are you getting your best risk reduction based on a key mission metric of the organization, delivering drinkable water or something like that. Yeah. And I don't know that I would argue with you that more money needs to be put on protection. I would probably say where we're under resourced is incident response and then the engineering, the consequence reduction side. And I think it's still something we have to figure out is how do we say this investment in detection is worth it? Well, how are we measuring that? And that's a challenge across the industry, but it's a good discussion. I like people starting to think about where they should put their resources.
Yeah.
Let's finish up. I don't know anything about your new company, so this is going to be news for me. What is INC Secure doing?
So I am keeping it small. I'm really enjoying it. I'm focusing on helping out Massachusetts water utilities, essentially secure their systems. So MWA, I'm helping them with some projects, and then I have several small water utilities in Massachusetts that I'm building them a cybersecurity program or assessing their cybersecurity readiness. And then this really cool thing that just occurred is I went with one of my clients who's a water utility. We went for a grant to build a collaborative. So we basically, at this point, we were awarded the grant. We have 9 water utilities, and we are going to try to address cybersecurity for the industrial control side collaboratively. So shared cost model, shared knowledge, and shared resources. Hopefully, maybe if we all start to do detection, maybe we can share costs on a SOC. If we all need to buy firewalls, we can pool our resources and buy one firewall and get a better deal. If there's something coming down that the water utilities who know nothing about cyber and don't want to know anything about cyber, we can meet and disseminate, this is how we're going to approach this. And so we got the grant. We have a few utilities already on, getting things up and going. But to me, that's pretty exciting because we're going to work together and try to, have a unified approach in Massachusetts. So that's what I'm doing cybersecurity wise in water. I'm also doing some regular automation stuff. And then the last thing is Dragos actually hired me back as a 1099 contractor, and I'm helping out on the OT CERT program with Don Capelli, which I actually love the OT CERT program. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. We're putting out how to, do this. So when I was at a utility and NIST, CSF comes out and you're like, you should have identity and access management. Well, how the heck am I going to do that? We're like, this is how you should do it. Click on this. Here's an example. So I really love OT CERT. And so I'm thankful they brought me back as a contractor to help with that.
Yeah. I've seen you've done some presentations on that with Dawn.
Yeah.
I've seen some of those.
She's awesome.
Who funded the grant?
So that Community Compact, it's a Massachusetts grant.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not EPA, not federal. It was a state organization grant.
No, but I did get so the state revolving fund grant money. I got some grant money to do some cybersecurity work through that. They through the state, but it ultimately ties back to federal, I think.
Well, I will give you. It's not my advice. It's from Seth Godin for people that start business. He said it's really important to understand whether you're a freelancer or an entrepreneur. And for a long time, I thought I was an entrepreneur, but really I'm a freelancer. I like to find interesting projects, maybe create a small team and do them. Building an organization wasn't for me, but if you can figure that out before you spend 10 years doing the wrong one, it'll make your life a lot happier. So good luck with the new company, Gus. If
Thanks.
someone wants to reach you, are you active on any of the socials, LinkedIn?
Yeah, I'm on
anywhere?
LinkedIn. I still have a Twitter, although it's less useful these days. And Gus at INC Secure is my email, so anybody can reach out to me in either of those things. And yeah, would love to chat with anybody about water security stuff.
Well, Gus, thanks for coming on the show. I needed someone that could explain the gory details of water, and you did exactly that.
Thanks, Dale. Appreciate having me.